What's on the docket today? Well, that's a mystery that's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Well, as those of you who follow this channel or listen to this podcast know, you know that this is primarily a philosophy podcast. So we wade into all sorts of different waters, everything from the burning questions, like which way are you supposed to put the toilet paper in, to things like cultural appropriation of language, the sort of taxidermy of Hollywood and IP, as I've talked about before, to matters of, philosophy of religion, like hiddenness, the problem of evil, and then wading into, inevitably, some of the areas where philosophy of religion and philosophy generally and culture carries us into specifically theological waters, talking about the essence and energies of God and talking about demons and all sorts of stuff. So it's a wide range. But as those of you know who follow this is not explicitly a theology podcast, and it's not even explicitly an Eastern Orthodox podcast. But those of you who know my thought, you know that I am a philosopher who ultimately became Eastern Orthodox. So once I start wading into waters about worldview and what I think about this and that and going into the specifics about God, it seems inevitable at some point the particularities of my worldview, being Eastern Orthodox, tend to come out. Now, I offer that caveat because today I wanted to wade into waters from a specifically Eastern Orthodox perspective, even though that's... Well, I wouldn't say that's out of step. Obviously, like when I dealt with divine hiddenness, at some point I had to speak to the particularities of the meta-narrative, which were particularities that were Eastern Orthodox. But today I want to speak about something that's probably of unique interest to those who are curious about Eastern Orthodoxy. And I suppose that's what stands out as a little bit out of step with our usual arrangement on this podcast. And that has to do with the question of the role of philosophy and reason and faith and so on in the Eastern Orthodox world. So Eastern Orthodoxy is relatively new to Western culture, right? It has been an outlier. Western culture has been largely Latin in its roots, meaning that it has been largely Catholic in orientation or Protestant of some form. And Eastern Orthodoxy, though it's been here, it's been sort of ghettoized, right? It's the sort of thing that you would find either in specifically, Slavic communities or perhaps amongst Greeks. In fact, that's one of the things that happens oftentimes. People hear I'm Orthodox, and after the first question, which is, are you Jewish, with the last name Jacobs, and you're Orthodox, the second question becomes, oh, you mean you're Greek Orthodox, and there's an association with the Greeks. But obviously, there's been this awakening to Eastern Christianity, to Eastern Orthodoxy, to the Eastern Chuch Fathers, and this has been gaining traction. It's gained traction partially because of the internet, where, word is getting out, right? People are hearing about it through different folks that are on the internet. It's also, and in that sense, Eastern Orthodoxy is new to the internet as well. But it's also sort of just been a lot of folks who in Western culture have grown disillusioned with their Protestant or Catholic roots, have ended up finding their way into the doors of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so there's been news stories about this. There's obviously been a lot of attention paid to it from different apologists from opposing traditions and so on and so forth. So this is a burgeoning thing, right? The spread and growth of Eastern Orthodoxy within Western English-speaking culture. And one of the things that happens inevitably with that is you get a variety of sort of new growing pains. And I had an appearance on Paul Vanderklay. I appeared on Paul Vanderklay not too long ago, where I talked a little bit about some of these growing pains. And there's a variety of them, right? I could speak to a lot of different things that are sort of interesting developments as you start to have converts come from, Protestant traditions or the Catholic Church over to Eastern Orthodoxy. But one of the ones that I want to talk about today is some of the percolating responses, reactions, thoughts, feelings, vibes, whatever, regarding philosophy itself. Because sometimes there are certain impressions that start to take hold, become popularized, they're repeated, they end up spreading through the world via the internet and whatever else, that are somewhat misconceptions about Eastern Orthodoxy. And one of those, or a set of those, I would say, has to do largely with philosophy and the Eastern Orthodox disposition toward philosophy. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this topic of philosophy, its relationship to faith and the knowledge of God, and speak specifically from my Eastern Orthodox position about that in order to clarify and clear up some misconceptions that may be floating about. So hopefully this isn't too far afield from the sorts of topics that we want to devote ourselves here to on the Nathan Jacobs podcast. So the first one, there's a couple of different versions of the sort of popularized myth that Eastern Orthodoxy is anti-philosophy. And I'll just say as an aside, it's interesting that, there's been a number of philosophers who have converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, myself included. In fact, St. Vladimir's Press did a book, I believe it's called Turning East is what it's called. And it's actually just a collection of testimonials about from different philosophers who ended up converting to Eastern Orthodoxy. And it was so popular, and there were enough of us doing it, that they decided to do a second volume and do a new collection of testimonials from philosophers who were converting to Eastern Orthodoxy. I'm in the second volume. And so if you dig back into the catalog of episodes on this channel and you find My Wild Ride to Orthodoxy, that's actually me reading my essay that's due to come out in that second volume of Turning East. So anyway, all that's to say is there have been plenty of us philosophers who actually have become Eastern Orthodox. I know quite a few of them. But somehow there has emerged this rumor that Eastern Orthodoxy is anti-philosophy, anti-natural theology, which is a form of philosophy. And so I want to address some of those and dispel some of those misunderstandings and frame for us a proper sort of picture of what the Orthodox disposition toward philosophy really is. So one of the things I'll start with, and I heard this years ago before I ever became Eastern Orthodox, when I would bump into folks who were, say, Catholics, but they were curious about Orthodoxy, and they'd talk to me about the differences between East and West, and they'd say, well, isn't one of the big differences that the West is all about philosophy and reason, and the East is all about mystery? And that's sort of an interesting misconception for a couple of reasons. The one is just because if you actually read the Eastern Church Fathers, I find it deeply insulting to them to suggest that they are somehow less philosophically oriented than Western writers. They are most certainly not. It's difficult to read people like Gregory of Nyssa or people like John of Damascus, who does, the fount of knowledge, where he's going through and giving you a catalog of philosophical terms and concepts and breaking down what the Eastern Church Fathers mean by those terms, so that when you read his exact exposition on the Orthodox faith, you can follow his arguments and understand what on earth he's talking about. It's an insult to folks like that to suggest that they're somehow less philosophically astute or interested than the folks in the West. That's certainly not true. But it's also very odd because it misuses the word mystery. So the irony is, the way a lot of people use the word mystery today is they end up using the word to indicate something like, I know not what, right? To say that somehow this is a thing it's just out there. It's true, it's a paradox, but really who's to say? Nobody can really understand it. Nobody can really exposit it. And we just have to accept it because it's just so, right? But it's just beyond our grasp. And that is actually nearly the inverse of what the term mystery actually means. So when you look at the word mystery and how it evolves in Greek and how it ends up being picked up in the Eastern Church Fathers, the term originally it originates from a Greek verb muin, which means to shut. And the reason that term was used is because it was used in reference specifically to mystery cults. where somebody who was going to be oriented into the secret mysteries of the cult would have to shut their eyes or shut their mouth as part of the initiation ritual. And then this gave rise to the word mystikos, which was the secret one or the mysterious one, something like that. And that referred to somebody who had been initiated into a mystery cult. And from there, you get the term mystery, mysterion, which is the one that you start to see used in people like Paul and then the Eastern Church Fathers. And the way it's used is actually not completely divergent from what you have in the old mystery cult language of it. So when talking about mystery, somebody like Clement of Alexandria actually understands mysteries not to refer to things that we don't understand, but to things we do understand and used to not understand. So, for example, Clement uses it specifically for the Old Testament, where he points out something, drawing on St. Paul, of course, that the Old Testament is filled with odd rituals and stories and things like that really kind of don't make a lot of sense to a lot of people. You're talking about boats and drowning everybody in the world, and you're talking about circumcision, and you've got animal sacrifices and all this sort of stuff like that. And what on earth is going on here? And the idea is that one of the things you see in St. Paul is the idea that these are all shadows. They're shadows of something that is to come. And then once the substance of the thing arrives, then you can better understand the shadow because you know what's casting it. And so for Paul, this is how he understands the relationship between the Old Testament and the New, the coming of Christ. This is why Paul is so negative about the Judaizers and the members of the circumcision, as he calls them, folks who want to continue to retain the Old Testament rituals, because he's like, why would you want to do that? These were just shadows anticipating something that's now here. They didn't actually do anything for you. They didn't cut away the old sinful nature or redeem you or truly purify you or anything like that. And now, like, the substance is here. Why on earth are you still screwing around with the shadows? And so this is one of the things that Paul talks about, and that's what ends up being echoed in people like Clement of Alexandria, where what he wants to suggest is that you have these mysteries, right? These old shadows that are there. And now that Christ has come and you've been oriented toward God through the knowledge of Christ, you've been initiated, you've been illumined, which is the language that's used in the Orthodox Church in reference to somebody who has been baptized and chrismated and welcomed into the church, the newly illumined. You actually are in a position to understand and see the meaning of those things that were previously just sort of cryptic and veiled from you. And so that's what the mysteries are, right? This sort of unveiling of things that you who have been oriented, you who are the true Gnostics, and far be it from me to popularize that term and create confusion, but Clement of Alexandria really did think that Gnostic was a good term for the Christians. It's just that you had the Gnostics end up screwing it up, and they used it for their own weird cryptic cult stuff. But he thought, like, you are the ones who are in the know, right? You've been oriented to the mysteries so that you can properly see them. And this is actually something that also comes out in somebody like Origen of Alexandria. So when he talks about the transfiguration and you have Christ on Mount Tabor and all of a sudden his robes, he starts to glow with divine energy and light. And then his robes themselves are also transfigured and whiter than anyone could possibly bleach them. And then you see him there with Moses and Elijah. Origen understands the sort of allegorical meaning of this. The picture that's being offered there is that Christ himself is the one who illuminates the law and the prophets, which is what Moses and Elijah represent. His light is what illuminates them and allows us to see them. And then he also interprets Christ's garments as the four Gospels, which are illuminated through the knowledge of him. Anyway, you have those sorts of things that end up coming through in the way that mysteries are talked about previously. So it's sort of ironic that the ways in which people use mystery right now is to say, like, stuff you just don't know. It's just paradoxical. Who's to say? Who's to say? And that's utterly contrary to it. Now, in terms of, I don't want to psychoanalyze people who do this or, try to, I'm not their judge. I don't know what's in their hearts or anything like this. But here's just a couple of observations of what I tend to notice about this trend. I really see this coming from this sort of punting to mystery, as I would call it, coming from sort of three different places. The one place that it comes from, I get the impression are folks that are just kind of like, they just want to live their faith, and they're not really philosophically astute, and dogma and systematic theology and things like that really fatigues them. They don't connect with it, and they don't really want to engage it. So oftentimes this is something that happens in Protestantism, right? Protestantism is so concerned with systems of theology, debating, things like predestination. Are you a Calvinist? Are you Arminian? Things like that, that folks within that world who are not terribly philosophically astute or aren't particularly interested in trying to wade through those waters and feel kind of overwhelmed by feeling like they have to make decisions about that sort of thing, would really like to be able to just say, like, who knows, right? And I get the impression that they are that sort of conflicted person. That one crop of people from which this comes are folks who are basically Protestants who didn't really feel equipped to tell you much about, the Trinity or Christology, or to weigh in on a Calvinist Arminian dispute and things like that. And what felt like it was a relief to them was the idea that that Orthodoxy talks a lot about mysteries, which it does, just not in the sense that some people today use the word. And so they get the impression that it's like, basically, if I come into Orthodoxy, I'm welcomed into being able to say what I really want to say, which is to say, well, the Trinity, God is three in one, but who's to say? It's such a paradox, but we believe it. Or Christ is fully God and fully man. Who's to say how that works or what that means? But we believe it, right? It's a mystery. Or I don't know, God is sovereign and we are free. And, how does that work out? Who's to say, really? It's a grand mystery. And it's really, they're looking for a lever to pull that sort of lets them off the hook for having to wade through those waters. And the hope is that because Orthodoxy talks about the mysteries, right, of the faith, that means that somehow Orthodoxy is an enabler of intellectually punting on things or something like that. And so that's where one group that I get the impression, they've sort of wandered into Orthodoxy with some sort of sigh of relief that they no longer have to do philosophy, which on the one hand, there is truth to that, right? Orthodoxy does not make the same demands. It doesn't expect you to be your own pope. It doesn't expect you to have your own sort of systematic theology. It tells you how to live primarily. And the church does harbor, the doctrines. It is the keeper of truth. It harbors the writings of the Chuch Fathers and things like that. But it doesn't demand that you are a master of those sorts of things. And so on the one hand, Orthodoxy does afford a person who is not inclined to navigate and try to master those waters to do exactly that. And, just sort of practice their Christianity without troubling themselves about those sort of difficult topics and leaving them to people like myself to worry about those sorts of things, because it's not their concern, right? They can look to the church as their guide and live their faith and no longer fret about puzzling over these sorts of matters. And so I think, with that sort of group, though, there is a tendency to somehow then attribute it to Orthodoxy, that Orthodoxy is more about mystery, right? It doesn't engage in those things, but that's not true. And in fact, it's not true, not only in the sense that I'd mentioned, like Gregory of Nyssa, John of Damascus, those sorts of folks are highly nuanced, as philosophically nuanced as any of the scholastics, but also when you look at the sorts of doctrines, when you really dig into the sorts of disputes, like concerning the ecumenical councils, right? The disputes about the Trinity between Arius of Alexandria and Athanasius. When you look at the Christological disputes, as well as the extension of the Trinitarian disputes and the Cappadocians that follow, when you look at the disputes over the will and things like that with somebody like Maximus, the confessor, or about the divine energies and things like that, these are actually very finely nuanced, philosophically technical distinctions. And I think it's in many ways an insult to those church fathers and to those councils to suggest that what they were doing was just sort of saying, well, these are mysteries, who's to say? We've just got to say that God's three in one. and but at the end of the day, it's a paradox, and who's really to say? Jesus, he's God, he's man, but who's to say? If you really understand those fathers and those disputes and the dogmatic claims of the church, you understand that they are philosophically finely nuanced. And so it's an assault to those people who suffered and died and shed blood and ink on those sorts of topics to suggest that somehow there's something philosophically thin there. It's not true. It is far from philosophically anemic. And so it's fine if a person wants to say, like, look, I don't understand those things. I struggle with those things. It hurts my head to try to get my head around those things. That's not for me. Thankfully, the church has a grasp on that, and they have people who are called to do that, but I'm not one of them, so I just live out my faith. That's great. That's great. That's totally permissible within the Orthodox Church, and that's what should be said. What shouldn't be said is that somehow the Church Fathers or the Church itself is philosophically anemic and is just sort of punting to I know not what when it comes to these finely nuanced topics. So that's one of the things that I find there within this trend that's sort of anti-philosophical that ends up popularized. A second thing that I see emerge that starts to rise within these sort of anti-philosophical bends is there is this tendency to talk about nous and the idea that nous is more than mind. If you haven't heard this, right, if you haven't been in Eastern Orthodox circles or listened to folks on the internet, this comes up a lot, right, where they're talking about, well, yes, but in Eastern Orthodoxy, we are, it's all about the nous, right? The nous, and it sounds so mysterious, and people are like, wow, what is that? The nous, what is this interesting new doctrine? And they'll say things like, well, we need to purify the nous and come to know God through the nous, and nous is not mind, and so on. Nous is mind, by the way. So in Greek, it does mean that. But what's going on here is that there's something that's true, but I think in some ways, either the way it's conveyed or in the way it's heard, there ends up being a misunderstanding or distortion. And I'm not suggesting that people that talk about nous necessarily understand that, don't understand that. I certainly know that, certain folks like Metropolitan Jonah, who I've interacted with on this sort of topic, when we were together at a conference not too long ago, I recognized that there was the potential for the sort of misunderstanding that I'm about to talk about. And so I asked a question specifically for him to clarify, and he did. And he clarified quite rightly. And so what is this misconception? Well, here's what it is, as far as I can tell. That the Eastern Church Fathers do, in fact, talk a lot about the knowledge of God that is somehow beyond just sort of rational analysis. And so the worry that sometimes comes up in the way that people will talk about mind is that they recognize that within the West, due to Latin influence, and then modernity, there's a tendency to associate mind with just analysis. And so within, Latin scholasticism, there was a tendency to talk about two faculties, the faculty of intellect and the faculty of will, and to suggest that basically what the intellect is the part of you that sits there and engages in some form of analysis, specifically about means and ends when you're talking about like choices, right? Okay, do I choose this? Do I choose that? I'm trying to get to this end. What's the best means to get there, and things like that. And so that sort of analysis is what the what the intellect does, computational analysis, things like that. And then the will is the moving faculty. That's what, is the part of you that acts. And so when you come to some sort of a conclusion, the intellect arrives at some sort of conclusion that this is the best course of action, the will acts. And so there's a sense in which scholastic discussions about the mind tended to reduce mind to a computational activity. The mind is the part of you that engages in conceptualization and analysis and computation and judgments and things like that. And so, and that was, of course, exacerbated in certain ways in modernity when you had people like René Descartes and, the rationalists who tended to treat mind as exactly that, right? That's the part of you that is conscious and engaged in analysis. So somebody like Rene Descartes, when he starts to talk about, the difference between mind and matter, like matter is stuff that extends in space and mind doesn't. And the self, the I, and the cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. Is the part of you that does, rational reflection, analysis, so in Descartes' Meditations, where he's engaged in skepticism and then trying to reason himself out of skepticism, that's an exercise of mind, and that's the I, right? That's the self. So there is a tendency within Western thinking as a result to think of the self as the mind and think of the mind as rational analysis, right? Some sort of that part of you that engages in rational analysis. And so I think what's happening rhetorically is that sometimes people are recognizing that the Eastern Church Fathers, and this part is true, understand mind to be more than rational analysis. And so when there's this resistance to nous doesn't mean mind, in some ways it's not, something is true. Something true is being said and something false is being said. The thing that's true is to say that nous is more than rational analysis, computational exercises or something like that. That's true. But to say that that is not part of mind would be false. And so it would be more accurate to say that nous is more than just computational analysis. Nous is more than just rational analysis. Or what the scholastics would call the intellect, right? It's more than just that. And that's true. And the part of that is relevant specifically to philosophy does go to the fact that the Eastern Church Fathers do talk about the fact that the knowledge of God is something that transcends or goes beyond that type of analysis. It goes to that something more. This is what I mean. One of the analogies that I find useful to explain this is to use the example of an infant. We'll make it a him, right? So he's nursing at his mother's breast. Does that infant know his mother? And the answer is yes. He knows his mother in a very intimate way, right? In a way that is more intimate than most people in this world ever would, unless she has other kids who also have that sort of relationship with her. But does the infant have a concept of what it means to say she's my mother? Does he have a concept that, well, there's a relational property here, and so we're of the same species, and I'm specifically gestated within her womb, so I am sort of an extension of her own substance, and so because I was gestated in her body and I feed from her body, and so on, this relational property, et cetera, et cetera. Does he have that conceptual framework? And the answer is obviously no, not yet anyway. Eventually, reflectively, presumably as he develops normally, he'll come to some level of understanding of what that means. But he has an intimate knowledge of her that's actually more intimate and deeper and more real and more connected than the conceptual framework. And he has it without the conceptual framework. And the reason this is important is because this goes to two types of knowledge of God. The one type of knowledge of God is one that is deep and intimate and connected. It's a form of participation where we actually move into and partake of the divine nature. We come to know God in that sort of intimate way, like the infant knows his mother. And then there's a knowing about God. And this is the sort of thing that somebody like Aristotle has, where Aristotle ends up looking at the world, and by looking at the world, he ends up inferring a first cause, and then he starts to infer certain things about that first cause, and he comes to a sort of a series of claims about that first cause, many of which are true. But the problem is Aristotle doesn't know God. And he knows about God, or he knows certain true things about God. And that's sort of the difference between what you're talking about when you're talking about the sort of rational conceptual framework versus this higher knowledge of God. Now, both of those are activities of nous, right? The mind, the rational nature, right? The mind is definitely the part of you that engages in that sort of analysis. Aristotle is using his mind clearly in order to come to knowledge about God. But it's also this other part of mind, right, that is involved in that sort of type of intimacy and the deep knowledge of God that we are called to, the sort of thing that the infant has. And so I think this is one of the things that sometimes leads to some misconceptions about the Eastern Church Fathers. The Eastern Church Fathers, some of them do end up critiquing, just like St. Paul critiqued, the pagans who have this sort of like wisdom about the world, but they still don't come to know God. And sometimes people will take that, specifically in St. Paul, that's the more sort of popularized form of it. They'll take that sort of that claim and they'll move from that claim to say, see, philosophy is worthless or philosophy is false or something like that. Let's springboard off of St. Paul, because this is one of the places where it's most popularized. A lot of Protestants, for example, who are familiar with St. Paul and aren't that familiar with philosophy and certainly aren't familiar with the Church Fathers, they read in St. Paul where St. Paul talks about the wisdom of this world. And he talks about how, through the wisdom of this world, they don't come to know God. And it sounds like he's denigrating the philosophers, basically, is what seems to be the upshot of that for a lot of people. And a lot of people will come away from that and say, like, see, so St. Paul is saying that philosophy isn't real knowledge, it's engaged in falsehood, it's ridiculous, it's worthless, et cetera, and that's why we just sort of read our Bibles, and that's where we get the real stuff. That is not how the Eastern Church Fathers actually understand that. I brought this up before, that St. Basil of Caesarea is somebody who is a good example of what the proper sort of position on that sort of thing is, according to the Eastern Church Fathers. Basil will actually say the way he interprets the wisdom of this world is to be wisdom about the world, meaning true things about the world. So when talking about the wisdom of the world, how Basil interprets that is that he interprets it as the philosophers inferring rightly true things about the world. He points out that the philosophers rightly understood that the world has structures of genera and species and common properties, right? The formal structures of reality. And with that, they also discern that there is innate in the order of things, purpose, teleology. And then from that, they end up inferring that the world emerges from something like a mind. And so they come to some sort of right inference that the world is not just random chaotic matter, but properly ordered and originating from something like a mind, and so on. So Basil says that's true, right? So that is the wisdom about the world. But the problem is they don't know God as a result. So they come to a correct inference. The world is structured. It's not chaotic. It emerges from something like a mind. But they don't come to know God as a result. And so talking about the higher knowledge of God, this deeper, intimate, actually coming to know God and participating in Him, is something that's above that. And in fact, this is how Basil understands when he talks about Solomon, wisest of men, right? He ends up reading Solomon's three treatises, right? So he points out that Solomon, we have three things from Solomon, the Song of Songs, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. And how he interprets these is actually that Ecclesiastes has to do with the realm of becoming, shifting matter that comes into being and passes away and is in perpetual flux. So that's the realm of matter. That's Ecclesiastes. Proverbs has to do with the structures of the world. This has to do with the forms. This has to do with the innate structures of genera and species, the order and nature and purpose of things. So this is that layer of reality. And then he suggests that the Song of Songs is actually about intimacy with God. And that has to do with that higher knowledge of God that the Christian is called to, well, that every human being is called to, but that Christianity offers a road to, where you come to know God in that participatory way that is intimate and deeply connected. And so if we're looking at this, what we would be saying is not that, nous and the knowledge of God is somehow it's just the Song of Solomon, or a Song of Songs and nothing else. It's just participation in God and nothing else. It certainly includes things like rationality, right? Like computational judgments, like analysis, that sort of thing, the conceptual framework. But it is not reducible to that. It is more than that. And that something more is something that opens you up to not just understand things about God, the rational analysis part, but to actually come and participate and know God, right? You, the image of God, ascending to your archetype and actually participating in him and partaking of him. So this is when the Eastern Church Fathers will sort of talk about they'll echo St. Paul, and they'll talk about the wisdom about the world and things like that, and they'll seem to denigrate philosophy. They're not denigrating philosophy. They're not suggesting that philosophy tells you falsehoods. They're putting philosophy in its proper place, where they're saying, no, philosophy actually does analysis, rationality, conceptual frameworks, and things like that. They do offer you something, right? They do offer you true things about the world. But the fact of the matter is that the knowledge of God is something higher. You're supposed to move beyond those. And that's one of the things you end up seeing in a lot of places in the Eastern Church Fathers. They'll talk about this sort of ascending up through this dark cloud of unknowing until participating in God. The picture is really sort of moving from these sort of conceptual frameworks that help you understand things that are true to leaving those things behind in order to move deeper into the reality itself. And incidentally, this is how they talk about everything. Like, this is how they talk about iconography. Like, at some point, the person is supposed to move beyond the icon that elevates you to the thing itself. The icon is instrumental in that sense. So just like philosophy offers some sort of a lower conceptual framework, a starting point for making an ascent, so the icon does. But ultimately, the person is to ascend to God himself and participate in him. It's ontological. It's not sort of a detached rational assessment. And so that would be the second thing, right? That would be the second area where sometimes philosophy is denigrated and sort of cast to the side because people are concerned that what's going on is that, philosophy is treated as if it is the be-all and end-all of knowing God. And the Church Fathers rightly point out that you don't actually, through philosophy, come to know God, right? You might come to know about God, but you don't come to know God, and we're actually called to know God. And on that point, I just want to allow me a little bit of an aside here. I was recently on Paul Vanderklay, at least when I'm recording this, who knows when this will actually drop, but where I talked about this sort of tendency. We talked about the death of evangelicalism. We talked about the growth of Eastern Orthodoxy. And specifically, we talked about the question of whether or not Orthodoxy can sort of survive American culture. And so permit me a little bit of an aside related to this, because I do want to offer in drawing this distinction between bare analysis, sort of the scholastic concept of the intellect versus nous, which is broader and includes that, but has more, right? And is what opens the door to this participation in God. I want to talk about at least offer one cautionary thing about Orthodoxy in America and anybody who's looking at it or has already become Orthodox. Something that I want to point out and hope that maybe, just maybe, you and I together, we can avoid the fateful pitfall I'm about to point out. So one of the things we talked about was this question of like, what on earth, if Orthodoxy really grows in America, what is Western, Orthodoxy in a Western culture, what does that really start to look like? And I think there are some people who are sort of nervous about that, right? They're nervous that Orthodoxy is going to take on an American flavor and become some sort of distorted, version of Orthodoxy that is not really Orthodoxy and so on. I want to make two comments about this. The one comment I'd like to make along these lines is just saying that first of all, I think it's actually perfectly orthodox that a certain culture, when it becomes orthodox, ends up giving its own flavor to orthodoxy. Now, I know some people might bristle at that, but here, allow me to explain what I mean. I think of orthodoxy and Orthodox tradition, all of that, kind of like sheet music. Now, I am not a musician, but I've known a musician or two. And while those of us on the outside tend to look at sheet music and we might think naively that it's sort of just a raw, bare rigidity such that it doesn't matter if I play it or you play it or AI plays it, it's all the same, right? Because it's all right there and it's locked in exactly as it's supposed to be. But my understanding from talking to real musicians is that that's not true at all, that there is a host of interpretations that need to take place in terms of how that's received, how the time is played, vibratos, all sorts of things like that, where the voice of the player ends up coming through rather clearly. And so the same sheet music, even though it might be understandable as the same tune, played by two different people, the interpretation varies and you can hear the player within the sheet music. And I think Orthodoxy is very much that way. I think you can just see that demonstrably, that it is that way. If you take iconography just as an example, icons have very clear patterns to them, right? They're supposed to involve these colors, this hand position here, right, etc. And so there's very clear specifications in place when producing an icon. And yet, anybody who is attuned to the Orthodox world, who knows something about iconography, you can tell immediately, that's a Russian icon. Oh, that's a Romanian icon. You can tell which culture it comes out of. Because even though they're following the same patterns, that culture, the voice of the player, ends up coming through in the iconography. The same thing is true in the liturgy. I step into a liturgy, I can tell you immediately whether I'm in, a Greek church or an Antiochian church or a Russian church, right? It comes through, that culture comes through. The liturgy is the same, right? They're performing the same liturgy, but the voice of the player, as it were, comes through in it. And I think that's exactly what is supposed to happen. So the idea that somehow in American Orthodoxy, you would end up having that we are rigidly imitators of Russia or of Greece or something like that, I don't think should be the ultimate fate of American Orthodoxy. I think it's appropriate that at some point American Orthodoxy gels into its own sort of culture. Now, not a culture that is a free-for-all. And this is what I think is the difference between sort of like bare rigidity, where we all speak Latin or something like that. And we're trying to transport a culture, not just a structure, but the culture with it into a new place. And chaos, right? A complete free-for-all where everyone just expresses themselves however they see fit. I think the proper Orthodox way is that the liturgy is translated into the language of the local people, according to canon law of Nicaea. And then with that, over time, that people inevitably, as it becomes incumbent upon them to not just import iconography, but to make their own iconography and things like that, you'll start to see the styles and the flavor of the culture, of its music, all that sort of stuff just come through in the sort of translating, as it were, of the liturgy. And so I think that's bound to happen. I think that's appropriately Orthodox. I think it's what we've seen across all the existing Orthodox cultures. Now, I'm aware that people are worried, like Americans like to be so individualistic and so outside of the box and so commercial and all that sort of stuff. They're worried that, well, we'll end up taking that as license over here to start doing pop song versions of things. Like, absolutely not. I'm not suggesting that. But I am suggesting that at some point you should probably be able to tell, like, oh, these are clearly Americans doing the liturgy, as opposed to Russians doing the liturgy. Now, this I say that in order to say that I think there is a version of an Americanized Orthodoxy that is wonderful and good and perfectly appropriate, and a version that is completely horrifying. And I'll tell you what I see as that pitfall, and it relates specifically to this question of philosophy. So the fact of the matter is that within the Eastern Church Fathers, there is a great deal of philosophy, as I said. There's a great deal of apologetics. There's a great deal of natural theology and all the rest. So that is perfectly in keeping with the tradition that's been handed down, the legacy of the Eastern Church Fathers and of the Orthodox Church. That's absolutely true. And I think it's entirely possible that we here in the West, as people who have a sort of an inheritance from modernity, we care about evangelism, we care about apologetics, we care about debate, we care about reasoning and things like that, that we may well have an appreciation of that dimension of orthodoxy that a lot of cultures that sort of take it for granted don't have. And so I think it's entirely possible that there's a version of orthodoxy as it emerges in America that is more deeply concerned with those aspects of the faith than other cultures, and appropriately so. I think it's entirely possible that what you would see is an American renaissance of Eastern Orthodox philosophy and of apologetics. And I think that would be a wonderful thing if, and this is the big if, and this is what divides the sort of like the glory from the nightmare. The if is as long as we Americans recognize that there is more to nous, more to mind than just rational analysis. And so this is what I mean. So much of modern philosophy and then religion, modernist philosophy and religion, produced an approach to religion in Protestant culture largely that was all about the head, right? It was all about what you know, right? That really sort of faith came down to, I believe certain premises are true about Jesus, about me, about God, and now because I believe I have my ticket to heaven, I'm saved. And then what do I do? Well, because I'm opposed to works righteousness and things like that, the thing I'm going to go do is I'm going to try to convert other people. And so I go in and evangelize. And I try to get them to believe the true things as well. And I engage in apologetics where I argue for the true things and all of that sort of stuff. And in many ways, spirituality becomes synonymous with knowledge, right? Going to church is all about the sermon, where I try to get more information. I read my Bible in order to try to analyze it and understand more true things about theology. And so spirituality becomes actually in some ways reducible to the exercises of the intellect, right? This sort of knowing about. And it's entirely possible, I could see it happen, that what you get with American Orthodoxy is something that is basically the new Protestantism. That what it becomes is, with all of these American converts, you have a bunch of folks who now, we believe this new system of theology, and we are dogmatically in favor of this system of theology. And all of our spirituality becomes about imbibing knowledge about this, reading about it, listening about it, coming to know it, and so on, and convincing other people about it and engaging in apologetics and evangelism and so on. But there's no living of it. And that's the thing. With Eastern Orthodoxy, if you really understand its spirituality, then one of the things that you recognize is that knowledge about the faith is a lower form. It's an entry point. It's a conceptual framework to start doing the stuff that is the real spirituality. And the real spirituality has to do with the participation in the life of the church, taking in the sacraments and things like that, participating in the divine liturgy. It has to do with reordering the nature, the higher and lower nature, by fasting, putting to death the passions, lifting up the soul to God through quiet and solitude and repetition of prayer and focusing on God. It has to do with those sorts of things where you're moving toward that deeper knowledge of God. So when I talked about the difference between analysis, right, the sort of that aspect of the mind versus the broader aspect of the mind that opens up intimacy, everything about Orthodoxy is all about the pursuit of that higher, more intimate knowledge of God. And so the nightmare would be that what you get is you get a thriving, sprawling Orthodox church in America, which lives in its head and is just a new form of Protestantism, where basically what it does is it has its theology, and it knows its theology, and it trades knowing more stuff for real spirituality. It starts to take a counterfeit spirituality where it just wants to know more stuff, and go in and tell other people the stuff, convert them, defend the stuff, and it never actually moves into the lived Orthodox faith, where it comes to actually know God and care about that higher knowledge of God, that deeper knowledge of God, understanding that the conceptual framework is just the starting point that you're supposed to move past into the true intimacy with God. Now, the alternative would be glorious, right? If what actually happened is that you had all of these American converts who, yes, they care about theology, they care about philosophy. There's a renaissance of Eastern Orthodox philosophy and apologetics and all of that, but it's paired with a bunch of people who really live the faith. And they understand that all of that stuff is a conceptual framework in order to move forward into a deeper knowledge of God. And they actually engage in fasting and prayer, asceticism, the life of the church, the sacraments, and things like that. And that's what you see lived out. And that's the knowledge of God that they really pursue. That would be glorious. And I would say that that would not actually be, even though it would be unique, right? Just like the Russian church is unique, just like, the Romanian church is unique, the American church in that sense would be unique. And that would be a good thing, just like the saints are unique, right? Some saints manifest as teachers and healers, and some are hermits and ascetics, and some are, healers and things like that. All the saints are different. And that's by design. Right? Each of us is unique. And even though we're all called to holiness and to partake of God, we're each unique instruments. And how that, holiness plays out and what it looks like in me is slightly different than what it looks like in you. And so we should expect that so it is with the church. When the church spreads, what it looks like when the Orthodox faith is manifest and fully mature in Russia will look different than the way it's manifest and fully mature in America. And that's a good thing. So long as I said, the pitfall is avoided. And that pitfall does go to that very thing that I talked about the danger of reducing mind to analysis. Okay, so those are our first two sort of examples of where I think there's a misconception about the relationship between Eastern Orthodoxy and philosophy. The one, as I said, is a misuse of mystery, that somehow Orthodoxy is less philosophically astute and not engaged in scholasticism. That's one of the things I hear oftentimes. This is one of the things that always throws me. Folks will say things like, well, yes, see, like the Eastern Orthodox Church is anti-scholastic. And they'll talk about like scholasticism, like it's an invention of the West, and it's the thing that's the marker of sort of the Western philosophical intellectual tradition, and that Eastern Orthodoxy is opposed to it. That's actually really weird. And I actually think whenever folks say that, it's indicative of a certain amount of ignorance about scholasticism, because scholasticism has no substance to it. There's no content to it. Scholasticism is just a method. It's just a method of inquiry, of doing philosophy. The sort of thing like if you've ever read Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia, you'll end up seeing it where it's basically like, well, our angels make question, our angels made of matter. Well, it seems they are, which is not what Aquinas thinks. And then he's like, here's an argument for that. Argument 1, argument 2, argument 3. Okay, on the contrary, that's what he really thinks. Now let me rebut the arguments. It's just a method for engaging in philosophical questions or theological questions. And it's an awkward method, which is why nobody uses it anymore. But the idea that somehow like scholasticism means something, like if you're a scholastic, you hold to this philosophical system, that's not true at all. All the medieval disputes were scholastic in nature. They didn't agree on anything. And so anyway, that's always weird when they're like, well, the West is scholastic and the East is not scholastic. That's kind of like the whole, like the West is into philosophy and the East is into mystery. That's actually not true at all. I suppose it's true that we don't have, the Eastern Fathers using the scholastic method. But that's just because nobody likes the scholastic method. I mean, it's terrible. But do the Eastern Church Fathers like raise a question and give arguments and use consider counter arguments and rebut those? Like, yeah, of course they do. Of course they do. It's just that they don't put it in that weird sort of janky method that you find in the medieval period. And thank God for that. I mean, nobody likes scholasticism, right? Anyway, let's go to this one last point that I see where this myth about like anti-philosophy comes up. And that's in this sort of weird anti-natural theology that I've seen as a trend that seems to have emerged with a lot of folks. And there's been this sort of rumor that's sort of cropped up from what I can tell. I'm not, deep into this, but it's something I brushed up against that seems to suggest that the Eastern Church Fathers are anti-natural theology. and that basically that you just can't argue somebody into faith or into the kingdom and something like that. Conversion has to be of the heart, and so therefore, like, natural theology is somehow worthless because you can't utilize it in order to persuade somebody. We all have sort of these sort of deeply ingrained presuppositions that can't be dislodged through reason, and so for that reason, you sort of can't engage in persuasion via natural theology. I don't know where this comes from. I actually suspect that where it comes from is maybe that there's been some Calvinist converts who carried this over from people like Van Til, because this was a very sort of I'm not an expert on this aspect of it, but this sort of presuppositionalist apologetic or epistemology is the sort of thing that you would find in certain obscure Reform circles, like these sort of like neo-Calvinist circles with people like Van Til. And again, not an expert on it, but my impression is that basically, at least in the sort of Van Tilian form, it really sort of reflected the presuppositions of Calvinism about total depravity and predestination. The idea that ultimately there was sort of these deeply lodged commitments and lenses that people had that ended up coloring their ability to see the truth and reason to the truth. And for that reason, what you needed is you really needed the Holy Spirit to convert them. And without that, they were sort of bound by their false beliefs, their hearts being hardened and their eyes being clouded and things like that. And this became sort of a means of denigrating natural philosophy, as if you might argue somebody to the truth, because ultimately the Holy Spirit needs to tap them on the head with his wand and change all of their belief sets or something like this. And that certainly makes sense if you are sort of a double predestinarian, total depravity, Calvinist type. It doesn't make really any sense from an Eastern patristic, Eastern Orthodox perspective. And I say that because, do people have presuppositions that might color their reasoning? Well, of course, yes. If I have false premises in my argument, that's going to color my ability. That's going to taint my ability to reason to a sound conclusion. Of course, that's just how reasoning works, is that premises lead you down a certain road to a conclusion. If you have false premises in your worldview, that's going to happen. But the idea that somehow those are can't be dislodged, or a person can't, sort of be reasoned to a position of correcting some of those false ideas is something that you don't find in the Eastern Church Fathers. In fact, I think it's in the opening of Gregory of Nyssa's Great Catechism, where he talks about the very fact that, you have to sort of look at where a person is at and understand what sort of commitments they have. And that will tell you what you have to work with. So if they're a polytheist, then you're probably going to have to reason your way with them, work with them to try to sort of point them to this sort of highest good, work your way toward something of a supreme being. If they already believe in a supreme being, now you might have to move toward like a Trinitarian sort of conception or something like that. In other words, Gregory of Nyssa is acknowledging the same sort of thing you find in Aquinas, actually, which is that if you're talking with an atheist, you can't start with the premise God exists. If you are talking to a theist, then you can start with the premise God exists. And so basically the idea being that the road from point A to point B varies depending on where you're at and who you're interacting with. But Gregory's presumption seems to be that you can reason with somebody and move them toward the truth, right? He doesn't have this concept that those ideas are somehow deeply lodged and can't be dislodged through the use of reason. With the Eastern Church Fathers, they are definitely advocates of libertarian free will, which I've talked about ad nauseum in different episodes where I talk about free will. And the fact of the matter is that Gregory is very clear that he thinks that how we respond to certain declarations about truth is actually within the capacity of the will. So he actually points out, the Bible talks about the proclamation of the gospel to people and then holds them accountable for how they respond to the gospel, which means They must have some choice in how they respond, because otherwise they couldn't be held accountable. And that goes to something I've talked about moral culpability before, that's ubiquitous in the Eastern Fathers, which is that the conditions for moral responsibility are that you know what you ought to do, you have the ability to do it or not do it. So you don't find in the Eastern Fathers, first of all, you don't find a denigration of natural theology, of philosophy. As I mentioned, you have all of this sort of philosophical content in people like John of Damascus, people like Gregory of Nyssa, and Basil of Caesarea is an Athenian-trained philosopher. But you will even find also natural arguments on the Orthodox faith, an exact exposition of the Orthodox faith. John of Damascus, before he goes into like the proper sort of like Trinitarian formulations about the Trinity, he actually levels natural arguments from reason for why God must have a logos. And so they do engage in those sorts of arguments. Gregory of Nyssa, like I said, does talk about the tactic and the importance of discerning where a person is at, so you can figure out what path you need to take them from where they're at to the truth. And they do put within a person's hands, to an extent, the capacity of the will to respond to declarations of truth. And so when I look at that, I'm like, I don't know quite what's going on there. It does seem entirely alien to the Eastern Fathers and seems closer to something like Calvinism, which is obviously not something the Eastern Church Fathers are sympathetic to. So anyway, all that's to say that the Eastern Church Fathers do not seem to denigrate natural theology or say that it is in somehow negative or something like that. They understand it as something that can be an instrumental means by which a person is turned back to God. After all, you are a rational animal, meaning what your mind thinks, right? What you think about the world does affect how you begin to approach and interact with the world and sorts of choices you make. And now, do they think that knowledge about God in the philosophical sense can save you? Like, no. And this goes back to the other point that I had mentioned, that they differentiate the wisdom of this world, right? Wisdom about the world, knowing true things about the world, or even from the world, true things about God, from the actual knowledge of God, the sort of intimate knowledge of God to which a person is called. They do differentiate that. And so there isn't a belief there that it's something like, well, hey, if I come to, if I reason my way to the right premises about God or even about the Trinity or something like that, that somehow this will end up saving my soul. They're not Gnostics and they're not Protestants, right? They don't think salvation is ultimately the grasping of a certain set of premises or claims that are true about God or about me or something like that. It's not a sort of a mental assent or concession to certain types of truths or secret knowledge or something like that. It is something that's ultimately participatory. So yes, the true knowledge of God is ultimately something that really comes from, I need to embrace, I need to repent, I need to turn to the church, I need to be received and united with Christ and receive the Holy Spirit through the sacraments. I need to engage in the imitation of Christ by putting to death the deeds of the flesh and, raising the soul up to God through prayer and all of that. Like, yes, that's true. But the idea that somehow that means natural theology has no place or could play no part in the conversion of a person is something that's entirely contrary to what you find in the Eastern Church Fathers. So anyway, so there you go. Hopefully that clears up some of the misconceptions that float about in the ether in terms of an Eastern Orthodox disposition toward philosophy. Okay, so there you go. Hopefully that clears up some of these misconceptions about the relationship between Eastern Orthodoxy and philosophy. The Eastern Orthodox Church does not punt to mystery. In the face of difficult problems, we do actually have a robust philosophy of religion over here. It's also that we do not suggest that a nous is somehow some mysterious part of you that doesn't involve analysis. Rather, the part of you, your mind, yes, it involves analysis, but you are more than that, and that something more is what allows you to have this higher participatory knowledge of God. And we don't denigrate natural theology because, natural theology, or this aspect of philosophy of religion, you might call it, is certainly an instrumental means by which to turn a person back toward God or lead them toward God or awaken to them to certain truths or things like that. But of course, just like everything else, it is a lower knowledge of God. Knowing about God and knowing God in the sense that we're called to are two different things. And so it has its place. It's just that the true knowledge of God is something much, much more that is had through the Orthodox life and the life of the church. So there you go. Hopefully that helps. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.
Hey, everybody, quick little break here. Since, we're going into deep territory that can really just sort of wear on a person, I think what we really need, we need an ASMR break. What do you say? Here we go.
Today we're going to be starting off with some Cheerios. I love Cheerios. I think everybody loves Cheerios. We're going to continue with some ground coffee. If you don't like coffee, grow up. Everybody likes coffee. We're going to be moving on to corn. Makes me think of the corn song. Popcorn tastes amazing. Moving on. The spray. The spray smells amazing. I wish you could smell it. It's a kitchen counter all-purpose spray.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.